Hello and welcome. Today we're doing a kind of nuts and bolts podcast, a little deeper dive into the specific topic of drought stress. Like I mentioned in one of the previous podcasts, here in Zambia right now, we're experiencing a very significant drought, which not only has led to some people with certain water sources like boreholes, etc., not actually having water, but also our main electrical power grid source, Lake Kariba, for hydroelectric is extremely low. And so we're experiencing significant load shedding, which means there are periods of time in the day. They say they're load shedding, 8 hours of no power, but the challenge is it's always during the 12 or 16 hours of daytime that you're experiencing this shedding. So most of the time we have to actually use power is in the night hours. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. And when I say ourselves, I'm talking about my guest here, Craig Harding from Riverside Farm Institute. Thanks for joining us, Craig.
Glad to be here.
So as you'll begin to see, Craig's frequent guest, because for a couple reasons. One, because we live here together at Riverside Farm Institute in Zambia, and also because Craig has really done something that I hope more people will do, which is, again, I mentioned in the past, go all in to say, look, I have shifted my paradigm in my mind, and now I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, and we're going to actually make all of our management decisions based on those paradigms. And since I have the privilege of living here, and he's a client of mine here in Zambia, really in a lot of ways, it's one of our most intensive testing grounds where we really get to measure because proximity. And so, but as a result too, my fate is directly tied to it. And so here we sit, from my house looking out over the pivot at this dry scape. And so we've been talking, what do we do about this? So in this podcast, we want to talk about drought stress. And what do I mean by drought stress? Well, we're talking about water shortages, but also included with that, there are many things that it can increase drought stress, including ambient temperature and your humidity levels, which our ambient temperatures above normal and our humidities below normal. And so the deck's really stacked against us. So in this podcast, I want to talk about that basically in three parts. So we want to talk about basically equipment, residue management, and then plant efficiency. That's kind of the bullet points we're going to go through in this podcast. By equipment, I'm talking about sprinkler packs, pumps, power, more of that equipment aspect. Residue management is it's so absolutely magnanimous. So how do we manage the residue in our cropping systems? Because that's going to determine the insulating effect of our soils and our carbon turnover. And then when we talk about plant efficiency, we're going to be talking about things like plant nutrition, healthy roots, organic matter, things like that. So let's dive right into it. When we talk about equipment, we're talking about irrigation. So Craig, when you're trying to manage water, which we're grateful, right, that we get the privilege of not having to only rely on rain. But as anyone knows who's managed irrigation, it's not as good as rain, and it's a challenge to kind of be God and try and give these crops what they need in a real world sense. So what are you seeing as the biggest challenges right now when it comes to equipment, when it comes to irrigation right now, and that's causing drought stress?
Yeah, I mean, the fact we're sitting on the banks of one of the larger river systems in Zambia makes a lot of my friends who are in the farming industry say, "Shut up about um, water. What do you have to complain about?" And because so many of them are dealing with either you're catching rainwater in dams or in boreholes or wells that they're using for irrigation, and which is much more sensitive. I mean, the river, up to this point historically has always flown, and so usually if I say anything, there's some looks, at that. But for us, it's a situation where we've grown in the past, 6-7 years. We've gone from 15 hectares of bananas to 63 hectares of bananas on basically the same infrastructure. And so we've been stretching that capacity through different mechanisms. And we'll talk about some of the things we're using to try to help reduce the amount of water needed as we go along. But basically, as we got into this situation with the load shedding that you mentioned, I did all my calculations, and the bottom line is we've got 2 center pivots, so 60 hectares of wheat that we will grow typically, and we have those bananas. And I got put in a situation this year where basically we have to decide: do we want to cut off 30 hectares of bananas, or do we want to cut off 30 hectares of wheat? Because there's not water to do both. And you say, well, how do you not have water? Did you just overbuild your system? Well, we actually readjusted our system at the beginning of the year to increase the amount of water we could pump at one time by about 30%. But now we have almost a 50% reduction in the amount of time we have power. So while the water's there flowing by you, you can't get it. You can't get it into the field fast enough. And so we're looking at, hey, we've planted one center pivot of wheat, and now we can't plant the other. And so we started looking at what the options, and that's kind of what sparked some of this conversation was, what happens if I can't figure out how to get more water faster? What does that look like? And I think I mentioned to Denver a little bit earlier was, water stress is kind of like welcome to hell. You start out with, not enough water, you get reduced germination, you get weaker plants. If any of your other sins get revealed, if you use salty or chlorinated things, you start ending up where you see that immediately in desiccated plants. And as they get weakened, what happens? Well, all your, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse show up. You get your aphids, and you get your, stink bugs, and you're going to get your army worms, and you're going to, and so you just end up in this situation where you already don't want to spend more money. You're already going to be stressed on the yield side, it. And now you want to put on more chemistry. You need to put on more. And then, your inclination is, well, let me figure out how to pump more water. So anyway, that's kind of where we are, is, what happens when you're staring into the abyss?
Oh man, yeah, thanks. So that you also often feel like you're stuck between two choices you really wouldn't like to make to begin with. It's not like, oh, if I do this, then I have what I want, and if it's just not that simple. And so it becomes mitigation, it becomes compromise. But there are several things we can do, and technology, man, I'm grateful for technology because irrigation has come so far, right? So we can talk about better nozzle, better irrigation packs.
Yeah.
But even at that, we make adjustments on irrigation, for instance, in the center pivot, and say, oh, let's try and put down slow water so that we really get it to seep in. But now we don't have that option, do we? Because we have a short amount of time to get it in. So now the only option we have is put more water on in a shorter period of time, which is a huge issue because what we have stacked against us immediately, as we know, is water infiltration. Our soil can only take water so fast. And so you can see how immediately now, okay, where we could make an equipment solution, it pretty quickly becomes a soil problem now. And we have to ask the question, how do we solve that with the soil? And we'll get to that next, which is we talk about residue, talk about water infiltration rates increase through soil porosity from whether it's glomalin, earthworms, reduced tillage, etc. But you can see, again, just as we begin to talk, right? Like we say all the time, there's no silver bullet. It's not, there's no easy solution to any of these. It's a systems-based approach. But we have come across an incredible technology that is helping water infiltration, is increasing the quality of water, which is the Rainmaker Earth. We've been using the Rainmaker water system here, trialing it in various locations on this farm, as well as other farms here in Zambia and in the States. And that technology really, I believe, is suited for this time. In fact, I know it is. And if you talk to any of the guys at Rainmaker, they'll tell you, like, it doesn't really shine in the great years. We see some nominal gains, but it's these instances when the deck is stacked against us, when either you need greater efficiency for your pumping, so your pumps can work better, or we need to increase water infiltration. Well, water won't go in when it's full of salts, etc., and it hits the soil and it beads up. And so the Rainmaker Earth water treatment system helps deal with some of those salts, increases oxygen, and makes the water more wet, for lack of a better term. Also helps to open that soil and let things go in. We see reduced compaction, we see increased water infiltration. And so all of a sudden something that seems like, okay, it seems like a nominal improvement in an instance like this affords us the ability to put more water on in a shorter period of time and actually get it into the root zone.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, literally as we look through Mike, the decision-making process I've been making over the last number of months, it's literally been, yes, how do I get more water on? So increasing pipe sizes, nozzle sizes, more water at a time. But immediately you start dealing with it. And in the past, when we tried to put more water on, you had issues. You got your, high magnesium, so you go out in the field, you feel the stickiness on the shoes. It gets worse the more water you put on it because in our case, our water has quite a bit of total dissolved solids. And so as that TDS is high, yeah, you're getting more water, but sometimes you actually see your plants look like they have more water stress, not less, if that's not in order. And so being able to see that infiltration, when you put the water on, it goes in, it doesn't go off with your soil. Because, we know both in dust blown erosion and in water erosion, the best part of your soil leaves first. Your organic matters, the best nutrients, your phosphates, they all leave, and you're left with something that's worse. And so if that water isn't going in, you're immediately actually going in reverse. So you devil in the deep blue sea. And so we definitely have seen that increase, and definitely the reports we've got show, immediately within weeks of that system being put in, significantly, they literally double the depth of water infiltration with the same irrigation. So if you have to increase irrigation for periods of time with bigger breaks in between, it's huge if you can actually have more of your capacity filled. And so I think that's huge. Definitely upsizing your systems. I think if you're looking at it, whether it's Zambia or anywhere else, if you recognize you're going to have power issues, well, then you're gonna have to look at upsizing your systems, bigger pumps, bigger pipelines, primarily get more water on quicker with the time you have, or water more blocks at one time, instead of having to stagger as many.
Yeah, and the other thing we do when we talk about equipment, so there's the irrigation equipment, but then there's the actual physical equipment, which may not seem like something that you would discuss in this instance when we're talking about water deficiency, but actually they play a huge role. And to that, I would say two pieces of equipment that immediately come to mind is our planter and our roller crimper, because without the ability to plant into reduced tillage or no till, boy, right there you're already losing, I would say, upwards of 50% of your water to evapotranspiration whenever you till that, not to mention the compaction, the tillage, from the tillage, and then the soil seals over and you can't get the water to go through, it beads up on the top, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also enable to use cover crops, which is not equipment, but again, without having that roller crimper or mower, but in my experience, the roller crimper superior. So anyways, tell me a bit about that experience, and how important do you think that is in a year like this?
Oh, I think it's huge. I mean, think about, certainly the Midwest of the United States. As you get across into the dry section, you cross the humid eastern part and you start into that, and you see this conversation all the time. You have what? You have chemical fallow, you have actual, tillage fallow, and people have done that for years to try to, soak up more water and save the water they have, not use it up. But what we've found is the guys have come in and done no-till with cover crops. They should be using up more water in your mind, but they actually find that they're better off from a net standpoint with that. And you ask yourself why. I mean, let's say chemical fallow, for example. You haven't tilled, so you haven't increased the surface area for evaporation, but they still find themselves with less water at the end of that fallow than this guy who grew a cover crop that used water to grow. Why is that? Well, one, cover crop traps the water. Two, you get the additional infiltration, especially as you roll or crimp that cover crop down, like we've seen. A diverse species of cover crop, one, collects water from more levels and layers. Then you lay that down on the ground and you say, well, you didn't incorporate it. No, but you created a microclimate that protects from the wind stripping off that moisture and basically creating a wicking system that's just real, really drought intolerant. And so you see this situation where growing more actually equates to more. And it's not just what happens on the surface, it's what happens below the surface. I think in the last podcast, we talked about organic matter significantly. When you get so much of the organic matter being made isn't actually residues we're finding, it's bug bodies, it's what's left from plant root exudates. More exudates and more living plants longer creates more water. And so I think those two tools, no-till, being able to go in without creating that surface area extension, and then rolling down so you have protection on that soil, are fundamental. And they create the habitat where things like earthworms create additional porosity, add the oxygen to the soil, and make it living instead of a dead ecosystem.
And it's amazing, again, how all these things are tied. There's nothing, as we discuss equipment, we can't help but talk about residue. And as we talk about residue and two pieces of equipment, no-till and roller crimping, I think about, okay, well, so irrigation, okay, you can put a smaller sprinkler pack on that creates finer droplets, so they're going to create less soil compaction, less compaction from that water droplet effect, which is believed to be one of the greatest, most erosive and compaction events in agriculture, whether you're in a tilled system or not. But so, okay, if we want to put on more water in a shorter period of time, I don't know how you're going to avoid larger drops. It's a real challenge. And so what we're able to do is, if you're able to maintain those crop residues, whether it's through roller crimping and you have stalks laying on the ground like we do right now, we sowed right into roller crimped sun hemp. And so you have a complete mat of residue. And so when that large water droplet comes down and hits the stem of that residue, it breaks the water droplet into small droplets and let it soak in over time. And so something as simple as a cover crop and a roller crimper all of a sudden becomes an aid to your irrigation system and almost a piece of equipment. But as we move into that, like we're discussing, the importance of residue is massive, because not only does it break water droplet tension and reduce surface compaction from rain events or from our irrigation, but it also serves as insulation, a blanket, protection to reduce evapotranspiration on the soil, a food source for microbes to eat so that we increase our microbial count, and a way to increase organic matter. And as we increase soil organic matter, we know water holding capacity is massive. What is 1% organic matter? Is something like 27,000 gallons in an acre of more water holding capacity. And it increases, I think it is, for every 1% organic matter you get, you can hold a 1-inch flood event, basically rainstorm event. So again, that's over a period of time. And so if we increase our organic matter, as we discussed in the last podcast, by 1%, we can put down another inch of water per hour, I believe is the figure there. That's absolutely massive. So again, it comes back to talking about building. We want to take this opportunity to discuss the challenges, but also to, if we haven't already started making some of these changes that seem nominal, that seem maybe not massive, we really need to talk about it now, because now's the time when we feel it, and now's the time when it makes up. So we need to be making these changes right now as we're feeling these pains. So do you have any more comments there on residue, soil residue, and the importance of building soils through increased residue, cover crops, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, especially when we're in a brittle climate, the idea that you're in a place with almost no humidity, the top layer of whatever you have is not going to break down. It's not going to become a nutrient cycle. It's not going to, it's not going to happen. So the more of it that you have, the more space on the bottom coming from the soil surface, the more biology is actually able to break it down. And so if you have just a minimal cover, okay, it's covered, but it's not very thick. In our environment, you're not going to gain soil carbon through that. If you have a thick mat, you're going to gain significantly more soil carbon, because the worms and biology can come up. It's moist enough for them to exist and go back down into the soil. So those things impact, top-down soil growth, I think, significantly.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's something else we've been discussing, which is intercropping. You think, okay, I have to preserve moisture, and so I certainly don't want to be spending irrigation on plants other than my crop. But in fact, that may be counterintuitive, because as we were discussing earlier, you were talking about the importance of canopy closure, which, man, I couldn't believe the difference here. So when I first arrived, it was in September, and it's so dry here. And so, look, I grew up in a desert in Eastern Washington. I don't know that there's drier. And I quickly found out, man, this might actually take the cake for dry. And I just can't believe the amount, the lack of humidity and the amount of evapotranspiration such that we had an entire blanket of wheat stubble. I mean, we had in places 2 to 3 inches of wheat straw, and we were running the center pivot 24 hours a day, wetting it. The soil was wet below. And I'm expecting this fungal bloom to just, and you get a fungal bloom for about 3 days, and then all of a sudden it goes away. I said, well, where did it go? Mm-hmm. And you find in the time you irrigate throughout the peak of the day, it dries out all the way to the soil. And it wasn't until we planted a cover crop and that cover crop had canopied that finally we started to see the humidity, the relative moisture remaining in that residue layer. And without it, that organic matter, that residue can't become organic matter. And so, we've been discussing using planting wheat in soybeans so that the wheat comes up and grows, has this nice effect where you can get canopy closure in between the rows of soybeans, and it's easily terminated with something like a wheat chemistry like clethodim. But also you were discussing something else. What were you discussing you'd like to use in soybeans as well as a companion, and why are you considering that?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been wanting to do for quite some time, and probably will do this coming year, is interplanting sunflowers with soybeans. So, if you do a light population of sunflowers throughout your soybeans, you're going to get this high crop that breaks some of the wind and whatnot, but it also has a root that just goes down and grabs that silica and the calcium and water that's really deep, and it shares it. And we saw this, I think, 2 years ago. We planted on our pivots, we planted cover crops that were mixed, and then I ran out of the mixture, and we had just a single crop. And the same water, the same environment, the single crop almost always dies 2 weeks earlier than the multi-species crop. And you'd say less plants. No, they share. There's a symbiosis. There's a synergy that comes with that. And we often miss it in our crops because, for harvesting, it's hard to clean seed and whatnot. And I think in some cases we should even potentially intercrop a sacrificial crop because we probably gain it on our monocrop just because of that impact on life and biology. Because to beat my favorite dead horse, the whole idea of narrow thinking, of this reductionism, it works in the lab. That's the only real world place that it really is that way. And so taking that out and looking at things in a little bit more of a community setting, things live together.
Yeah, so that community, the idea of community setting, and working together, I think leads us right into talking about nutrition and physiology. Mm-hmm. I think probably chief most, and again, talking about beating a drum, but it's probably the single most important, because look, we believe that if we feed the soil feeds the plants, and healthy soils resist pests and diseases. And all this comes to living soils, and living soils are only living when there's microorganisms involved. And everything we're really discussing is around those microorganisms, isn't it? I mean, the way we irrigate, the way we manage our residue, the multi-species of crops, those are all talking about the same system. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about microbes. And when we talk about microbes, these microbes have abilities to do unbelievable things. In fact, basically all the things we're going to talk about next, these microbes mitigate, encourage, or take part in. And something incredible we managed to observe, talking about water holding capacity and drought stress, was when we did a large scale potato trial in Washington State, mm-hmm. Where we did just business as usual, with superb potato producers, some of the best potato producers in the state, maybe even in the world. And we did our program side by side, just doing different things, honoring that, saying, look, we're feeding the soil first. It's about feeding that soil, taking care of that soil. And then the plants, they come afterwards. And what we found was through using microbial teas, through using exogenous food sources and mineral sources, we increased the population of microbes in that soil dramatically. And what that led to down the line is we had in-field soil probes monitoring electrical conductivity and total soil moisture and temperature was not only incredible things we saw in the EC, which that's really the only reason we put the probe there was to monitor the EC. But in fact, we found the greatest gains was in the moisture. And what we found was middle of August, 14-hour day length, over 100 degrees, 40 degrees Celsius in the daytime temperatures, bulking tubers. We found over 100% increase in soil moisture capacity, but we avoided saturation. We were still under saturation. And so what was amazing is you could dig side to side, and we found, like, if you dug, actually the side with less water was muddier, and the side with more water, over 100%, was less muddy. It hadn't reached saturation. And yet, really the main conceivable difference was carbon, because we were putting massive amounts of carbon in, but really it was biology. It was those microbes. And so we talk about that. Every one of those bug bodies, they have a phospholipid fatty acid bilayer and microbes, and they're a storage unit for water. They're not alive unless they have fluid. They're not alive, and when they're alive, they're saturated. But that's encapsulated by that lovely little cell wall that keeps the water there, not in the soil, not loose in the soil, but available. And then, of course, obviously the fungal aspect, which is, we know mycorrhizae, fungi, etc., are able to access water with inside soil particles that roots can't even penetrate into. And so I think after residue, and our equipment and everything we can do, what are we doing? We're building a home. We're building a lovely little home.
That's right.
For our bug buddies. And then if we build it, they'll come, especially if we put them down there and feed them. And that's what we're doing. We're just making cozy zones. But how massive is that? And that's pre-OM. Now, we found recently in our recent podcast, we're talking about increases in soil organic matter, at least over a four-year period of 50 and 100%. So if you can increase soil organic matter and you increase the water holding capacity goes through the roof.
So jumping in on that, I just want to highlight the fact that when you looked at the EC probe on the field that was traditionally treated, it looked like a dead body. You look at that straight line, heartbeat, and on the one that had life being fostered, you could literally see a daily heartbeat of nature coming back to what it's naturally supposed to do, which is to have this daily cycle of electric conductivity, which is related to the biology that's in the soil. And the amazing thing about that is when you got to the end of the potatoes, you had more water left in the soil than when you began, compared to one that had less potatoes, less quality, and had less water. And so coming back to it again, I often have people ask me, why do you spend the money to irrigate from the end of wheat to the beginning of soybeans with a cover crop? Like, that's money. Every time you're pumping, it's literal cash you're pumping out. But if you can have biology alive, holding nutrients, continuing to cycle carbon, my question is, can you afford not to? Because, think about, Gabe Brown's frequent reference of, what are you doing to your underground livestock? If you turn off the water to your above ground livestock for 60 days and you want to turn them back on, what's going to happen? They're not going to be there. You're going to spend significant portions of time to try to get them back to stock levels for the few that survived. It's exactly the same thing. And, not everyone has that luxury of even being able to do that. But when you do the math, sometimes the math that costs you here saves you double the money over here. And so I think looking at that system in a long-term balance sheet, a long-term profit and loss versus a short-term what's in the moment costing me money is going to pay off in the long term.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's a big challenge, because even, especially here, I noticed it here. You see it in other parts of the world as well, but here I'm noticing a lot of crops that are irrigated on drip, for instance. And I go to this system, and I can understand why. Absolutely, we're trying to maximize the amount of whether it's avos or macadamia or whatever crop it is. We're trying to maximize the amount of plants, trees. Obviously we have to manage the canopy, etc. So okay, we have to space the trees based on population, canopy, etc., and then leave space for us to actually get through them and harvest or whatever it is we need to do. So we're saying, let's just put the water there for the trees. But I know it sounds radical, but the truth is, it's an entire ecosystem. The whole space is living in together. And when we're not watering outside of the drip line of our trees, there's an entire, all of your minerals, the mineral potential that's there is not being utilized. The microbial potential there is not being utilized. And the interconnectedness between organisms, between one tree to the next and one row to the other row, isn't what it could be, because we know if we can keep microorganisms alive and we can keep plants and roots alive in between those two. It's like a world wide web. It's like a global network. And those now we start to function as an entire ecosystem. And it's even challenging as well. There's periods where we say, well, I don't really have the water, so we're going to shut that down. And we have to do what we have to do. But I really think what you're saying is true. The pivot is a great example. And I think these other irrigation schemes can be as well, which is, it sounds like it's a waste, but we're leaving more on the table than we have any idea about. And if we can see it as a living unit, as a resource, it kind of goes back to livestock, for instance. Like you look at guys running cow-calf operations, and they'll tell you that the nutrition of that mother in between calving cycles is directly related to the quality of calf you'll have following. And it's really tempting to say, oh, well, she's just a cow right now. I just got to keep her alive until we're ready to get her pregnant. But a good livestock manager will tell you, no, if I keep her healthy in between calving cycles, A, she's going to have healthier calves, and B, she's going to calve for a lot more years. And so it's exactly the same with our soils, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, on that to note, we talk about our short wheat cycle. So we're in one of the shortest wheat cycles in the world. I mean, I've had people comment on social media because I have pictures of me planting bananas and harvesting wheat, and they're like, "Excuse me, bananas and wheat. They're, how do you have these on the same farm?" And we're just in a narrow window where we have an extremely fast period of time where wheat grows. And so if you look at like the Zadok scale, you're flying through it. Sometimes one unit a day on the scale. And so, one of the things that you're talking about when we talked about, canopy, well, move your nitrogen early. Well, that's a good practice in a place where we have very fast cycling wheat. Move the nitrogen earlier. It helps you close it earlier, helps you do all that. But with that temptation is the temptation. We want to put less passes on our sprayers. We want to, have our guys putting fertigations at less times because we have to oversee it less. And it's to dump large quantities of fertilizer, which, the best fertilizers you can buy all still carry salts. And some of them that are not so good, they carry chlorides and other things. And so what you can literally see is you say, oh, I want to save water. I want to build my canopy fast. I dump the fertilizer too fast, too soon in single applications. And what happens? You desiccate the plant. You go out there and you say, well, how come I put all this water and all this fertilizer and now my plant looks like it's drying out? And why are there little crystals on the outside of my plant? And Denver can jump into what's happening there, but there's a physiological process happening as well as the damage to the biology that takes place.
Oh, you're 100% right. And the hard thing is, it's so much of the time it has to do with concentration gradients. And so, we talk about salts. What is a salt? Well, salt is generally forms when you react an acid and a base, and it forms a crystalline compound, which is then able to be dissolved into solution and become ionic. And so when we talk about salts, the things we're discussing are transient, and those salts, you can talk about ammonium sulfate as a salt. You can talk about potassium nitrate as a salt, but they're good things in dilution. Then they're ions, and potassium nitrate. Yeah. You could argue, well, nitrate, it has a limited use because it causes problems. Ammonium sulfate for sure, amazing. Free sulfate, man, that's great. Plants love it to a degree, right? And so when you put it on at too high of a rate, like you're saying, the concentration gradients changes, your total dissolved solids are too high, and your electrical conductivity is too high. And we have to remember these plants are electrical operating systems. And so when we overload those, and they don't have a decision because we have the luxury of putting on these ionic water-based fertilizers. We need to complex it with carbon. Just that goes without saying. The last podcast, I think we beat that drum. I just still don't think we beat it to death. But it's a whole episode on it. More to come still, but so that helps. But even so, you have these ions that can concentrate and increase the electrical conductivity. And when we increase the electrical conductivity, basically these plants burn, they fry, and when they take those up in ionic water-based solutions into the plant parts, basically they can actually become resistant to water. They can't take any more up. They take these ions up, and now they're oversaturated, and we've completely upset the balance of that. And we can really mess with things like turgor pressure and the plant's ability to operate. We can break systems, and they basically just sit there and flood out the water that they do have, and you'll see it. I mean, the plants often turn pale blue, which we think, well, that's just a lot of nitrogen. But we actually now know a lot of times that's actually more chloride stress from something like potassium chloride. But I know you know nothing about that. And look, we're learning, right? So.
Yeah, I think one of the things we see that, at least for me in the past has been puzzling. Like, let's say you get a good compost, and say you go to the nursery store and you're buying it for your home garden for your wife, and you pick up the bag and you look at the back, and we're farmers, so we look at what NPK, and you look at the label, and there's like, I'm paying all this for nothing, but you put it on the garden, and what happens? You get all this growth, and you say, well, how come with nothing I'm getting all this response? Well, what's happened? It's complex with carbon. It's complex in a system that allows for that osmotic pressure factor. While there's less there, it's feeding constantly a little amount, and it's actually getting good uptake, versus the reverse, where you water your plant with a product and you're actually drawing water out of your plant as you water. You think, I'm putting water down, and your plant's getting less water in it. And so you look at that, and then you think about what Tom Dykstra says about plants. I mean, about salinity and these different things. Well, what are you doing when you create that blue plant? What happens after that? Well, we see insects show up. The aphids start to show up in the blue plants. Well, what happened? We literally turned our plant into a giant antenna, saying every insect in the world that's supposed to decompose, destroy, and get rid of dead and dying material, come on over here. And then we have to go spend thousands of dollars on chemistry to then mess up our protein synthesis so that we can buy something else. And so, we just really upset that. And so I think those are really yeah, exactly. We really underestimate the impacts of salt. So one of the things I would suggest is that while we're having drought stress, we further dilute the amount that we feed a plant at one time. So we spread it out, we teaspoon it on. Is it more work? It is. But it will have an impact in the amount of water our plants retain and the disease pressure that we face as we have stress.
Yeah, that's right. Just be practical. Just think about it like, oh, it would be really convenient if I could eat 5 days meal in one day, and then I don't have to eat for 5 days. Like, we would say that's absolutely absurd. Yeah, what human is going to do that? But that's often what we're doing in plants. Well, let's feed them for 3 weeks today, or let's feed them even for a week today. The truth is, if we can afford it logistically to just spoon feed it, and every time the pivot's making a pass, be spoon feeding those nutrients we need along with carbon, I think you'd find it's a whole nother ballgame, because they don't eat in slugs. They eat one day at a time. And the other thing is, okay, well, we can think about it in terms of plants, but those microbes are extremely sensitive as well. And when you put down too much in one period of time, not only do you kill off a lot of them because of that concentration, you can look, you could do a simple experiment under a microscope where you take a microbe solution and just dump salt in it and then observe afterwards. I'll tell you, it's going to be a mass extinction event. But then the other thing you can consider is just through concentrations. There are certain organisms that are meant to break certain things down. And when you put a slug of one thing in, the population dynamic shifts, and that organism species becomes dominant. And so that's massive. But also the other thing we talk about is stomatal regulation in plants and plant hormones. So when plants become drought stressed, we see any kind of stress in plants. Okay, ISR, SAR ramps up, but then we often see jasmonic acid and abscisic acid come up in plants. And these are things that are natural hormones, and they're there for reasons within the plant to react to stressors. But if we see abscisic acid jump up, for instance, we're going to see the plant start to senesce too soon. We're going to see fruit drop happen in tree fruit as a very good example. We're going to see shrimpy little kernels or aborted mesh in wheat, and so that comes through stress, through various stressors. Today we're talking about drought stress, but many biostimulants really help to reduce that. So we can talk about kelp, which
Yeah.
ramps up your SAR in advance. It actually stresses the plant in a good way. It's not exactly stress, but it stimulates SAR, which ramps up the plant immune system and gets it ready for stress, so that when the stress hits, it's now ready to weather the storm. We can also talk about one of our most exciting new tools, which is plant flavonols. We use a particular product called Crop BioLife that we continue to use, which is amazing. It's an extract of the bitter orange rind, and there's studies showing that it increases the number of stomatas on the plant leaf, and it also increases stomatal regulation or efficiency, which helps the plants to close the stomata. Sometimes when they're stressed, those stomatas get held open, and the plant just sits there and gasses off water. And this actually helps the plants to be able to actually open and close those stomatas more easily to conserve water and have more stomatas. So that means when you do get the humidity in the morning or whatever, and that plant's breathing in, it's able to breathe in moisture as well as CO2 more efficiently. And also a note to that, they've actually found that it's changing the epigenetics of plants and tomato plants, literally changing the epigenetics, triggering genes to be more drought tolerant. Like, seems like a superpower. It's too good to be true. Wait, it's plant based, it's all natural, it's low rates of application, it increases stomatal regulation, regulates the plant, triggers epigenetics, makes the drought stress. Like, it seems too good to be true. And again, it's low use rates and affordable.
Yeah. I think that's, I was just talking about this morning, like, hey, you get double the stomata. Shouldn't that cause you to be breathing off more moisture? Well, yes, except for it's more efficient. Then you pair that with something like silica, which we've talked about before, but just continues to be an underused, overwhelming factor where it reinforces the function of the stomata. So those are things we can begin to use that, completely help with drought stress and plant resistance to disease and pest.
And so let's talk a little bit about what that looks like, because you've got the biostimulants, but then you've got the nutrients, and so I think paradigmatically it looks like, for one, we like to use sap testing so that we can see inside the plant and see what's going on in that plant cell. What are our analytes in real time? And I know there's a lot of people, rightly so, say so. It's hard to manage this because even in the states where we are, you pull a sap, and in 5 days you get the results. You can make a decision. You're still a week to 10 days out from making the change, but I still believe it's some of the best information we have, and especially to test as a report card, to test when we're going in there to mitigate stress. How are we doing, and what's changing inside the plant? We get to ask the question: how's our sodium? How's our chloride? How's our aluminum? Which are direct indicators of pest pressure and stressors. But when we're trying to make these impacts, what we're trying to do from a management perspective, again, is holistically say, okay, how do we do this? How do we manage our residue on the surface? Through equipment. How do we manage our water? Through equipment. But then as we move on, how do we manage those things through cover crops, through crop rotation? How do we manage that through product application? Well, we do it through sap testing to see what we have. We do it by placing a greater emphasis on calcium and silica than perhaps we have just on NPKS. We do it by when we make, we know we can only make so many passes in the crop, and I think we have 3 scheduled foliars. Maybe we can squeak 4, but probably not this year since our drone's not at peak condition. But you only get so many attempts. So it looks like being decided. It looks like our first vegetative pass. We make our first foliar spray. Let's make sure we're emphasizing our iron, our copper, our magnesium, our silica. Why iron? Well, we know iron is critical for our chlorophyll, so that we can have maximized photosynthesis. But iron and copper are also right there at the first line of defense when we incur stress. Photoinhibition, photooxidation can be mitigated if we have sufficient iron and copper. They're the first responders in that. Silica, we know a thicker leaf cuticle directs more sunlight. It helps to seal it off from fungal damage, but also helps to preserve moisture and efficiencies. Calcium for structure. So I mentioned the foliar spray, right? We're going to make sure we emphasize certain micronutrients, and we're going to pack as many we can into that LV1, that product we've been discussing at Soilcraft, that Leaf Vigor 1. So it's going to have amino acids. It's going to have carbohydrates. It's going to have biostimulants like the crop BioLife, like kelp. It's going to have nutrients, trace elements that are important for every crop. And then we're going to pull a sap sample and say, how did we do? And then say, you know what? We missed a little bit here in this crop on this farm. Next year, we need to make a change. Make a note. Next year, we're changing our program.
Maybe on the whole foliar thing, for some people, they're like, hey, I'm putting a multi micronutrient fertigation on, and I've got a good soils report that shows I have iron and magnesium and copper. Why should I put that on? And I would just compare it to, there's some of us who, if there's a piece of cake around, we're probably going to eat it. There's some people like Denver, and to get him to eat a piece of cake, you might need to get the fork and be like right in front of his face. And then once he takes a bite of the cake, well, guess what? Once he got a bite, he's going to want more of it. And plants are very much like that. When you give them a bite, even though that foliar might have just been a tiny bit of what the crop might be able to utilize, it reminds the crop, hey, wait, I liked that. Let me get more. And there's actual science that shows that you get increased soil uptake after a foliar application of micros. So put it on a platter, put the fork in the hand, and get that crop to eat.
That's a great example. I like that one. Yeah, 100%. Look, we can speculate. There's some science suggesting to the reason, but we don't know. We honestly don't know the method, but we know it does work. And so, like you're saying, let's leverage that. So we make an early vegetative pass foliar spray. We'll make a pass at in wheat. We're going to make a pass at just prior to heading, basically, so that we can stack the deck in our favor. We can use that as an instance to get our copper down, to reduce lodging. We can use that to prepare for flowering. And then after we have flowering, we're going to put down a foliar spray for grain fill and make sure we have appropriate levels of manganese so that we get good viable seed. And again, at every step, we measure. We make an application and we measure, and then we make notes to improve our crop year after year. And you might say, yeah, but every year is different. So how do you know that the notes that you made and the changes you make are going to be perfect for next year? And of course, we don't know. We absolutely don't know. But that's why
that's the beauty of biology. Exactly. That's the beauty of not using solitary strains, using that diversity, like we talked about in some of the other things, using things like IMO, using things like Johnson Sioux, using things like lactobacillus into those mixes. And that's what's coming in some of these product blends. They're not just minerals. They're packed with diverse biology. Well, guess what? Just like cover crops, when you have 10 varieties, every year a different one is more successful. It's the same thing with diverse biology. You go back in and you level that playing field. You shuffle the monopoly board back so you don't have dominance and you don't have disparity, because you're using diversity. If you're just doing single strains, if you're just replacing biology as if it was chemistry in single individual isolated systems, you're back to reductionism all over again. So avoiding reductionism by using these diversities where biology and mineral nutrition are combined, you eliminate that risk. You don't have to be dialed in perfectly because it's already built in, ability to be, protected for
100%.
differences.
100%. Exactly. I was talking to somebody else the other day and talking to them about what we believe is a worthwhile investment. You say, well, okay, if we're going to put on these soil products, this SV1 like we have at Soilcraft, okay, we're going to spend money on these carbon products. So how much money can I pull from somewhere else to spend that money? And rightly so. Like, I get it. Like, we have fixed budgets. But the truth of it is, if we want to have a healthy, nutritious, high yielding crop, and we want to build soils, if we make the investment here and now, and we can in fact increase soil organic matter as probably the best example, we are now building our resilience. We're building our bank. We're making deposits for withdrawal at later dates, so that, because we can't. I'm not going to sit here and have the hubris to say that Denver Black or Soilcraft team or everyone in the regenerative space can know what needs to be known to give the crop what it needs when it needs it. Get out of here. That's ridiculous. It is such an unbelievably complex system, and it's designed to function. But we can encourage, we can reduce plant stress with some of those foliars, and we can build the soil organic matter. We can build the microbial community so that when we put on our first fertilizer, and in between the first and second one, the crop needs more than we've given it, or something else. Oh, shoot. Well, if we're in a hydroponic based type system where we're only feeding it chemistry, it's now going to experience withdrawals. It now lacks what it needs. But if we have invested and deposited at a prior time to build this microbial community, to build a soil organic matter, we now have a reserve. We don't want to withdraw from it if we can help it. But we now have the means so that when we're missing those steps, when we can't afford logistically to get across it, when we can't afford physically to buy the fertilizer at this point, or we just don't know, it will take care of that system. We're doing our best to steward and to build and to give in these systems that are not natural. They're not. It's not the bush. It's not the forest. It's not the wilderness. Yeah. But that's it. We're building resilient systems, and we are in good faith saying we believe that if we honor the system as it is and we invest into it in advance, then it will pay us back in dividends down the line, and we absolutely know it will. It's a absolute.
Yeah, and we see that. I mean, we see that in the whole chase of biodiversity, the whole chase of biomimicry. It comes back over and over and over again. You look at almost any of the giants whose shoulders we stand on, and they'll refer back to what did they do? They respected the creation, and they respected the designer. And those are two key things. If you're going to look at a system and try to optimize it, go to the guy who made it and go to the system in its original form and borrow those things from those systems. So looking at biodiversity, brings those things to a strength that we can't get if we are going to isolate things. We have to be holistic in our approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I really think that's it. I think if we have the humility to admit that the system is vastly superior to our intellect and our logistical abilities to manage it, give it the attention it needs, and yet also in gratitude realize that we get to do that. We get to steward. We get to live in these systems and produce food for ourselves and others. We can begin to I guess see things. I guess at that point, what I'm saying is it becomes unavoidable to be holistic. It's completely unavoidable because we realize that there is no single point in which I am going to make a large enough impact. And in fact, unfortunately, I'm going to, when I think I can make that much of an impact, invariably, I screw it up. I have now stuck my finger far too inside, upset the balances, and now I get to pay, right? We get to pay. Yeah. Now we get to pay the bill. We have to go, okay, I've upset it. Now I have to come in. And that's when we see the pesticides coming in. Why? Because generally speaking, we have taken too great of a role and we have viewed things too narrowly in this crop cycle, just this crop, rather than looking holistically and seeing the farm as a living ecosystem, as Jerry Bernetti so wonderfully expounds on in his book, which I'm sure has changed so many lives as mine. We can say, look, we're a part of this. Let us play our role humbly and let us learn together how we can work together. And it's just absolutely incredible because as you start to say, okay, when we talk about the advances and the progress we've made, it's very challenging when someone says, why?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, how much time do you have? Right. I think you can see again, classic, we're at 53 minutes in our podcast and we set out to do 25 and we said, let's be really specific. But it's just not possible. But it's also what's fun, right? I mean, like, I think anyone who's in this space of regenerative agriculture will say, like, I've never enjoyed my career more and I've never been more challenged. But that's why we're in it together. That's why we have to collaborate, work together, and continue to move this system forward, and take a systems approach to individual farms because every farm is different, every region is different.
Maybe just one last thing I would say is I think in that approach, when we show up at our field, do we show up in our field with a pocket full of answers, or do we show up at our field with a mind full of questions? I think if we go back and we show up with questions, we'll be much more well served than if we show up with a pocket full of, whether that's single strain biology, whether that's chemistry, that's whatever. If we show up and say, I need to learn something today. Why did this happen? Why is this happening? Why does this look like this? Then we're sitting at the feet of wisdom to be able to learn, versus showing up in arrogance and finding ourselves slapped more often than not when we
Absolutely
had the answer and get embarrassed, you know?
No, that's right. And that's absolutely it. Look, we're doing the best we can to measure everything we can measure so that we can be better managers and quantify everything we can. But the beauty of it is if we honor the base principles, if we like my favorite example would be, in the Bible it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And really, if you unpack that and look at fear, you say, well, what does that mean? And really, when you really dive deeply, it means to revere in awe. And that's what it means. Like you're saying, it means to go to the field and to revere it in awe, to say, man, who am I to say I'm going to understand this whole thing? I'm not, but I'm going to sit quietly and revere it in humility and ask in my instance, ask the one who's created it, please give me wisdom for such a thing that I can't understand. And it's when we do that, we humble ourselves and we open ourselves up. And that's the basis of all science, is observation. Then we can, I really believe we can observe things. We can make management decisions that are vastly more effective than, like you said, if we go there with the presupposition that I've got all the answers. I know what needs to be done. And I know what I'm doing, but that takes time. Yeah. It takes time
for sure.
So, well, we've done our best here to actually give you some nuts and bolts and to not ramble on. But I hope you find value in this podcast. And please reach out to us, contact us on our website, call us on the phone, comment on our videos, etc. Like and subscribe, and ask us more questions, please. The best way we can have the best content really is if you're telling us what you're doing or what you want to know, what you want to know more about. We're going to do our best to actually, again, put more nuts and bolts to this, more practical aspects. Follow us on YouTube, where we'll do our best to have short content videos where you can see and hear about what we're doing. We're doing our best to try and get good content out there to you. Our number one thing here is to just try and give the most slam-packed content we can. But please reach out and comment so that we can know what we're missing, because it's a big subject and there's so many things that we don't hit on. And thanks again, Craig, for working with us, for working with me, for sticking with it. Even I'm sure there's times where you're thinking, wow, I'm in the great unknown, but for doing that and for joining me on the podcast today.
I'm happy to do it. Glad to be here.
All right. Thanks. We'll see you again next time.
Hey, thanks for tuning in and watching our content. We really appreciate you and appreciate you watching our videos. Please like and subscribe if you like what you're seeing here. Also, look down in the description down below for our website, link to our Regen Agronomy podcast, and our phone numbers and email, etc. Reach out to us, please, if you want to know more about the content you see here in the videos.